Amy Austin Holmes is a fellow with the Wilson Center's Middle East program and is also an Associate Professor of Sociology at the American University in Cairo. Amy, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So we're going to be talking today about ongoing crackdowns on civil society in Egypt. For people not monitoring the situation, could you provide an overview of what the circumstances are?
Sure. So I've been teaching at the American University in Cairo since 2008, so since before the revolution that overthrew Mubarak in 2011. And really, the sort of crackdown began at the end of 2011 when there were a number of international organizations, including ones funded by the United States, that were raided, and a number of people were put on trial, including American citizens. I think at the time people thought that this would be perhaps limited to these international organizations, but what we've seen is over the past years, this crackdown has expanded and now, is targeting virtually every sector of Egyptian society. After the overthrow of Morsi in mid-2013, there was a crackdown on his supporters, primarily from the Muslim Brotherhood. But very soon, the crackdown expanded to the secular opposition, the non-Islamist opposition, to media. There are hundreds of websites that are blocked now in Egypt, which you cannot access. Cultural initiatives, women's groups, NGOs, scholars, students, researchers.
When a similar crackdown occurred under Mubarak, it led to his overthrow. Is Sisi in any jeopardy in that regard?
Well, it's interesting because actually in January 2011, when the uprising sort of began, in the morning of January 28th, 2011, he shut down the entire internet, including cell phone services. So, I woke up in the morning on January 28th and there was no internet and there was no cell phone service.
You didn't know what was happening at the time, just assumed it was a technical glitch?
Well, yeah, I didn't know. And so like many people, I went out to see what was going on, to meet with my friends, because I couldn't contact anyone in any other way other than, by physically going in and trying to see what was happening with my neighbors, etc. And then went to Tahrir Square, where, of course, hundreds of thousands of people converged and the protests continued until he was deposed on February 11. So I think actually that that this media blackout, did in a way actually inspire people to protest, but what's happened now is the regime has been shutting down websites one by one, or,
so not
10
as noticeable.
or 20 at a time. And so it's not like the internet still does work, but you have many, many websites, including independent news sources like Madam Masr, which are blocked. And you can access them here in the United States or outside Egypt, but not in Egypt.
Do you, when you're teaching, when you're living there, do you feel any sense of a threat in this regard? Feel like perhaps what you're talking about could be monitored? Any of that sort of big brother paranoia in place?
Well, there is, the American University in Cairo is a private university, so we are in some ways protected. One of the first things that Sisi did when he was elected president was to pass a law in the summer of 2014 that gave himself the right to appoint not only every president of every public university in Egypt, but also every dean of every faculty. So this is one way that the state can sort of, penetrate public universities in Egypt and control, to make sure the loyalists are, running the university at the highest levels, which is, of course, a problem if you're interested in, critical thinking and academic research, etc. AUC has, however, also, been targeted. A former colleague of mine, Ahmad Shaheen, was sentenced to death in one of these mass trials, which they've used to, intimidate, arrest, and sentence some people to life in prison. There was just a mass trial 2 days ago, I believe, was the last one, where there were, I think, 400 or more people that were put on trial at the same, basically at the same time.
And only a couple dozen acquitted, and all the rest were given varying sentences.
Different sentences, that's right, yeah.
So the international community has been somewhat muted in its criticisms of what's been happening, even though human rights organizations and legal rights organizations have really been critical of these mass trials as one component of this crackdown. Why the muted response from the international community? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, that's a good question. President Obama actually never invited President Sisi to the White House. However, Trump has, and as we know, he met with him actually just yesterday at one of at the UN meeting. There were sort of a meeting on the side between President Trump and President Sisi. And in the past, Trump has actually described Sisi as a fantastic guy. Now, if you consider that Sisi was the person who oversaw the Rabaa and Nahda massacres in 2013, which was in August 14, 2013, this was the largest massacre in post-colonial Egyptian history, where over 900, possibly 1,000 people were killed on a single day in downtown Cairo in broad daylight. I was at the Rabaa sit-in on the night before and at Nahda the morning of the massacre on the 14th. And, to describe the person who was at the time Minister of Defense responsible for ousting Morsi and who was head of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, which, was in charge of overseeing and orchestrating this massacre, as a fantastic guy is simply, horrendous. I mean, it's unacceptable.
There's been a pattern with him of expressing admiration of a sort for strongmen. Mm-hmm. Your friends, the people you have personal connections to who've been arrested, are you in touch with them? Do they have any sense of representation, of hope to be released?
Well, so I'd like to talk about actually two groups of people that I think are important, because one of the reasons why, your question about why has there not been more criticism, the State Department actually issued a report just very recently regarding the human rights situation in Egypt, which they, clearly say the human rights situation is deteriorating. They mention the mass trials, the forced disappearances, etc. Under U.S. law, Egypt needs to be making progress towards democracy in order for us to justify continue providing $1.3 billion in aid to Egypt every year. So Egypt is the second highest recipient of military aid in the world. And I personally think it's, high time that we reconsider this aid package to Egypt, given the, deteriorating human rights situation. Now, and among other things, in addition to making progress towards democracy and protecting human rights, Egypt should also be protecting its minorities. Now, the Coptic Christian minority, as we know if we've been following the news, has suffered as the Islamic State has expanded in Egypt. There were 4 attacks against Coptic Christians in 6 months in Alexandria, Cairo, Tanta, and the Minya. So this is in mainland Egypt, not in the Sinai Peninsula, which is often sort of the focus of this reporting about the jihadi groups in Egypt. But the problem is that President Sisi has kind of used these attacks against Coptic Christians to, empower the regime and give the security services more power, and as a justification to continue to crack down on the opposition. But, blocking hundreds of websites is not going to protect Coptic Christians. Arresting the opposition is not going to protect Coptic Christians, etc. So, I think clearly Egypt has failed to protect the Coptic Christian minority. And the Pope Francis actually visited Egypt in the spring in order to show solidarity with the Coptic Christian minority. Another minority group that has not received nearly as much attention outside Egypt especially is the Nubian minority. And this is an ancient, indigenous population that's been in Egypt for not hundreds, but, thousands of years. The Nubian civilization, dates back, is as ancient as the ancient Egyptian civilization. There are pyramids, ancient Nubian monuments, etc. And over the course of the 20th century, they were forcibly displaced 4 times because of building of dams along the Nile. Now, the new constitution in 2014, there's an article included in the constitution, Article 236, which actually gives Nubians the right to return to some of the land from which they were displaced in the past. So this is a constitutional right of the Nubians. And last spring, in the spring semester, when I was teaching at the American University in Cairo, I had invited a number of Nubian guest speakers to discuss, this issue, because it was a class on, the title of the class was Borders, Wars, and Refugees from the Ottoman Empire to the Islamic State.
Is the average Egyptian aware of the plight of Nubians?
Not as much, I think, as, as one would hope, perhaps. So I was quite shocked when I learned after these speakers, spoke to my class about the history of the Nubian displacement, that not a single one of my students had actually ever seen maps of Nubian villages in Upper Egypt before. They'd never seen the Nubian language written before. And so one of the people who I invited was Mohammed Azmi, who at the time was the president of the General Nubian Union, and he is also the founder of NubaTube, which is a YouTube channel that promotes the Nubian language. So because, as part of the sort of pan-Arabic movement, and even before that, the Nubian language has been really suppressed. So not a single school or university in Egypt offers instruction in the Nubian language. And so this YouTube channel that he founded, I think, is quite important in the sense of, keeping the language alive, and allowing, the younger generation of Nubians to continue to learn and speak Nubian who were not taught the language in school. Mm-hmm. In any case, on September 3rd, he was at a protest, a small peaceful rally in Aswan, along with a number of other Nubians, and they were singing Nubian songs and chanting. So they were, basically promoting their own cultural, heritage and their language, and also asking that this article in the Constitution, 236, be activated. They were entirely peaceful. It was a small gathering. They were arrested, and since then they've been held in a security camp run by the Amn al-Markazi, which is the Central Security Forces. It's referred to as the Shalal camp.
Charged with what?
With holding a protest, with distributing flyers, obstructing traffic, harming national security.
In other words, whatever they could come up with.
Right.
What are their prospects for release?
Well, they were actually supposed to be released yesterday, but the prosecution appealed the decision to release them, and so now will be detained for another 15 days. So probably, I guess in about 2 weeks their case will be heard again. But I think it's important to draw attention to this because they are a minority group that we often don't hear about, and they were only asking for the constitutional rights. I mean, I've lived in Egypt through a time when people were demanding the fall of the regime, revolutions, overthrowing the president. And, by comparison, their demands were nothing more than asking for their constitutional rights.
Is there anything on the calendar that could shake up this equation? Elections, anything like that people can look forward to?
Well, there are supposed to be presidential elections in 2018, in the spring. A number of opposition figures have been intimidated. There's a case brought against Khaled Ali, who's one of the sort of opposition figures from the
and a potential presidential candidate.
Yes. So it's not clear, what will happen. It's too early to tell. Yeah.
Thanks, Amy. A pleasure.
Thank you.